The gun went off before anyone even screamed. One moment, the crystal chandelier was throwing golden light across 300 guests dressed in silk and diamonds. The next, a baccarat wine glass exploded on the marble floor, and the music died like something had reached into the room and ripped its throat out. In the silence that followed, that terrible, suspended silence that only happens when something has gone irreversibly wrong, every eye in the ballroom turned toward the door. And there he was, Jun Hyuk Shin, 38 years old, jaw like carved stone, eyes like two pieces of black ice that had never once reflected warmth. He stood at the entrance of the mansion, with his fingers still raised, his gold-plated Glock pointed at the ceiling, a thin curl of smoke drifting from the barrel. The warning shot had already done its job. The crowd parted like water before something ancient and cold. He wasn't looking at the crowd, though. He was looking at her. And she, Rejoice Igbo, standing across the room in a backless emerald gown that caught the light the way Lagos sunsets catch the ocean. She saw him, and something in her face changed. Not fear exactly. Something older than fear. Something that lived beneath the skin, beneath the bones, in the place where old wounds go to wait. She had prayed she would never see that face again. She had been wrong. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let us get into this story. To understand what happened that night, you have to go back to the version of Rejoice Igbo that existed before the mansion, before the life that looked, from the outside, like something conjured from the pages of a fairy tale. You have to go back to the girl who arrived in Seoul at 23 with a single suitcase, a linguistics degree from the University of Lagos, and a ferocious, barely contained hunger to become something the world could not ignore. She was brilliant. Everyone who met her said so, and they were not wrong. Rejoice spoke 4 languages fluently and could navigate a negotiation the way other people navigated staircases. Without thinking, without effort, her feet finding each step before her mind even registered she was moving. She had come to Seoul on a cultural exchange scholarship, intending to stay 18 months, learn Mandarin from native speakers in a multilingual research environment, and return to Nigeria with credentials that would open doors her mother had never even been allowed to knock on. But Seoul had other plans for her. She met Jun Hyuk at a rooftop party in Gangnam on a Tuesday night in October, when the air was cold enough to see your breath and the city below was a galaxy of man-made stars. He was standing alone at the edge of the railing, looking down at the city, the way a man looks at something he owns. She had not known then what he was. She had not known about the Shin organization, about the silent empire he had built through bribes and bloodshed, and the kind of discipline that broke lesser men in half. She had only seen a beautiful, remote, intensely watchful man who, when she walked up beside him and said, "You look like you're deciding whether to buy the city or burn it," had turned to look at her with an expression of genuine, startled surprise, as though no one had ever walked up to him without fear before. "I haven't decided yet," he said. She laughed. He did not smile, but something shifted in his eyes. Something deep and tectonic, like a fault line absorbing a tremor. They were inseparable within a month. What followed were 2 years that Rejoice would spend the rest of her life trying to understand. Because loving Jun Hyuk Shin was not like loving a person. It was like loving weather. You could not hold it, you could not control it. And on certain days it was devastatingly, heartbreakingly beautiful. And on other days it destroyed everything in its path without apology. He was generous, and then he was gone for 3 weeks. He was tender in private, and then he was terrifying in public. He drew invisible lines around her. This is where you go. This is who you speak to. This is how far your freedom extends. And when she pushed against those lines, as she inevitably did, because Rejoice Igbo had never in her life allowed anyone to put a fence around her, his response was never violent, never loud. It was something colder. A silence that lasted days. A canceled flight. A locked door. She stayed longer than she should have. She knew it. She had known it, even while she was staying, even while she told herself that the good parts, the real parts, the parts where he held her face in his hands and looked at her like she was the only solid thing in a dissolving world, were worth everything else. But there is a point that every person who has loved the wrong person with the full force of their heart eventually reaches. A morning you wake up and look at the ceiling and realize that who you are becoming in this relationship is not someone you recognize or like. That the hunger you came into the world with, that gorgeous, restless, world-eating hunger, is being slowly and systematically starved. She left on a Thursday. She did not tell him she was leaving. She simply called her best friend, packed the things that mattered, and walked out while he was in a meeting. She left a single note on the kitchen counter that said, "I deserve more than what you know how to give. I pray you find peace." She was on a plane to Lagos within 4 hours. He did not come after her, not at first, but he did not forget her either. And in the world of Jun Hyuk Shin, those two things were not the contradiction they appeared to be. They were simply 2 stages of the same storm. Rejoice rebuilt herself. That was the only word for it. Rebuilt. She returned to Nigeria with a broken heart and a ferocious determination to ensure that no broken heart would ever bring her to her knees again. She leveraged her multilingual skills, her soul connections, and an almost frightening sharpness of mind into a career as an international trade consultant. Within 3 years, she had offices in Lagos, Abuja, and Singapore. Within 5, she was the kind of woman who received invitations to rooms most people did not know existed. It was in one of those rooms, a private dinner in Macau 2 years ago, that she met Chairman Da-jung Park. She had known, going in, who he was. Everyone in certain circles knew who Da-jung Park was, the way everyone knows where the sun is even when they are not looking directly at it. He was 61 to her 31. He was the quiet center of an organization that made Jun Hyuk's empire look like a neighborhood corner store. The Park network operated across 14 countries, managed assets that governments preferred not to examine too closely, and had survived 4 decades of international scrutiny through a combination of absolute discretion, impeccable political connections, and the kind of patience that could outlast anything: treaties, administrations, vendettas. He was not handsome in any conventional sense. He was short, gray-haired, with the careful, measured movements of a man who had learned long ago that stillness was its own kind of power. But his eyes were extraordinary. Warm, genuinely warm, in a way that Rejoice had not expected and could not entirely account for. He had looked at her across the dinner table that night in Macau and said, "I have read about your work with the Meridian Trade Initiative. You solved in 11 days what their legal team had been arguing about for 8 months. Their legal team was arguing in bad faith," she said simply. "I just pointed that out, in a way they couldn't ignore." He had smiled, slowly like sunrise. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what you did." They had talked for 4 hours. She had not flirted. Neither had he. It was something rarer than flirtation, two enormously capable people simply and fully seeing each other. He called her 3 days later, not to ask her on a date, but to ask her opinion on a restructuring situation his Singapore team was mishandling. She gave it to him straight, without softening a single edge. He listened to every word. 6 months later, he told her he was in love with her. She took 2 weeks to think about it, not whether she had feelings for him, because she knew she did, but whether she could build a life that encompassed both the woman she had become and the world he inhabited. She was not naive about what she was stepping into. She understood the architecture of his power and what it meant. She understood the risks, but she also understood, more deeply than she could articulate, that Daijung Park saw her, the full, complicated, magnificent reality of her, in a way that Jun Hyuk never had and never could. Jun Hyuk had loved the idea of her, the exotic brightness of her, without ever truly wanting her to be free. Deo Jung loved the freedom itself. He loved her hunger. She said yes. They had been engaged for 8 months when she planned the party. The house was a wedding gift from Deo Jung, a converted colonial-era estate in the Lekki Peninsula, Lagos, retrofitted with every conceivable luxury and wired beneath its elegant surface, with a security system that cost more than most people's annual GDP. He had bought it because she had mentioned once, in passing, that she had always wanted a house with a garden large enough to get genuinely lost in. He had remembered. That was Da Yung Park. He remembered everything. The party was her idea, a celebration of their engagement, an introduction of her world to his, a night of music and food and the kind of deliberate joy that Rejoice had learned to insist upon. Because joy, she had discovered, was not something that simply happened. It was something you built, deliberately, with both hands. 300 guests, Afro beats and Korean jazz, alternating seamlessly. Yalof rice and Korean barbecue and champagne that cost more per bottle than most Lagos mortgages. Rejoice moved through the room all evening like a warm current, laughing, embracing, introducing people, navigating the social geography of the party with the same fluid intelligence she brought to everything. She was spectacular that night. Everyone saw it. The emerald gown, the natural hair piled high with 3 diamond pins that caught the light, the laugh, full-throated, Lagos-born, completely unperformed. Dae-Jung was not in the room. He was upstairs in the study, on a call with his Singapore team that had run long. He had texted her at 9:30, "Finishing soon. Save me a dance." She had smiled at her phone and typed back, "You have exactly 20 minutes before I find someone better." 3 dots appeared. Then, noted. She had been smiling at that exchange when the shot went off. The sound cracked through the room and shattered the spell of the evening as completely as if someone had thrown a stone through a painting. Rejoice's head snapped up. The champagne flute trembled in her fingers. And there, framed in the grand doorway of her home, stood a ghost she had spent 3 years willing out of existence, Jun-hyuk Shin. He was flanked by 4 men. They were dressed to blend in, but they did not blend. Their stillness was too precise, their positioning too deliberate. They were soldiers, and anyone who had spent time in certain worlds recognized them immediately. The panic in the room was quiet, controlled. These were not people who screamed, but it was real. People began moving toward the walls, toward exits, with the careful speed of the experienced. Jun-hyuk walked through them all like they were furniture. He crossed the ballroom floor slowly, deliberately, his eyes locked on Rejoice the entire time. And she did not step back. That was the thing about Rejoice Igbo that people consistently underestimated. Fear lived in her. She was human, she felt it. But it never reached her feet. Her feet always stayed planted. He stopped 3 meters from her. For a moment, neither spoke. The room held its breath. "Rejoice," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, quiet, controlled, carrying the specific cold authority of someone who had never in their adult life needed to raise it to be obeyed. "Jun-hyuk." Her voice was steady, remarkable given what was happening in her chest. "You just fired a weapon in my home." "A warning," he said. "To whom?" "To anyone who might interfere with what I've come to say." She tilted her head slightly. Around her she could feel the guests recalibrating. The old Lagos, money, the diplomatic crowd, the quiet figures from Daijung's world who had been stationed around the room since 6 o'clock and were now very still and very watchful. She needed to control this. She needed to control this before it became something else entirely. "You should not be here," she said quietly. Something flickered behind his eyes. Pain, she thought. Actual pain, buried under 17 layers of ice. But there. "You left without a word," he said. "I left a note. 4 sentences. That was more than you deserved," she said, and her voice did not shake. Not once. Jun-hyuk's jaw tightened. He took 1 step closer and lowered his voice so that only she could hear what came next. "I looked for you," he said. 2 years. Do you know what it does to a man? To look for something for 2 years and find nothing? "I needed you to find nothing," she said. "That was the point. I need to understand why." "You understand why," she said. "You have always understood why. You just do not want to accept it." Something shifted in his expression. The ice cracked slightly, and beneath it was something rawer and more dangerous. Not the coldness she had braced for, but something almost desperate, which was in many ways worse. A cold Jun-hyuk was predictable. A desperate one was not. "Come back," he said. The room, despite itself, seemed to collectively stop breathing. Rejoice looked at this man she had once loved with everything she had. She looked at the architecture of what he had built himself into. The granite exterior, the controlled menace, the way he held his body like a weapon, even while asking for something tender. And she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not hatred, not fear. Something closer to grief. Because she could see, clearly and without illusion, what had been lost in the making of Jun-hyuk Shin. What softness had been burned away? What capacity for ordinary happiness had been sacrificed on the altar of his empire? But grief was not the same as capitulation. "No," she said simply. His eyes hardened. "You don't understand what I'm asking." "I understand perfectly. The answer is still no." His voice dropped lower, and the warmth, the brief, vulnerable crack, sealed itself back over. The cold returned. "I don't make requests twice, Rejoice." "I know," she said. "That was one of the things wrong with us." What Jun Hyuk did not know, what he could not have known, because in his intelligence gathering he had found Rejoice, but had not found the full picture of who surrounded her now, was that he had walked into a room that was not undefended. Dae-jung Park's people had been in that room since before the first guest arrived. 4 in the ballroom, 2 at the rear entrance, 1 in the kitchen, 1 on the roof. They were not Lagos muscle. They were not the kind of security most people in that world employed. They were the kind of people who operated at a level so refined it was almost invisible. And they had been watching Jun Hyuk since his vehicle cleared the outer gate. Upstairs, in the study, Dae-jung Park had ended his call at the exact moment the gun went off. He had heard it through the floor, a sound as familiar to him as birdsong. And in the 30 seconds that followed, his phone had lit up with a message from his head of security. 3 words: Shin Organization, Ballroom. He had sat very still for a moment. Then he had stood, straightened his jacket, and walked to the door. Downstairs, Jun Hyuk had taken Rejoice's refusal and was now recalibrating with the particular, dangerous efficiency of someone accustomed to obstacles. Recalibrating away from requests and toward something that had always served him better. Leverage. "I know things about your business," he said quietly. "The Meridian Initiative, the Singapore accounts, things that certain parties would find very interesting." The room temperature seemed to drop. Joyce's expression did not change, but her eyes, those extraordinary dark eyes, shifted, sharpened. "Is that a threat?" "It's a reminder," he said, "that the past never fully disappears, that people who walk away from certain worlds carry those worlds with them." "I carry nothing of yours," she said. "You carry everything." He was closer now. Close enough that she could see the slight tension in his throat, the tell that had always given him away. Jun Hyuk Shin, who showed nothing, who revealed nothing, whose throat tightened when he felt something he could not control. "You always will." It was at this precise moment that a voice came from the staircase, measured, unhurried, carrying the specific, bone-deep authority of someone who had never once in 40 years needed volume to command a room. "Mr. Shin?" Every head turned. Dae-jung Park descended the staircase the way you descend a staircase when you own the house and the night, and every implication of both. He was in a simple dark suit, no tie, hands loose at his sides. He was not tall. He was not physically imposing in any dramatic sense. But the air in the room changed the moment he appeared, the way barometric pressure changes before a storm. Perceptible, undeniable. Something felt in the chest, rather than seen with the eyes. Jun Hyuk turned, and for the first time that evening, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, Jun Hyuk Shin went completely still, because he recognized the face. Of course he recognized the face. There was not a person in their world who would not recognize that face. Daejung Park was not a name whispered in back rooms. He was the architecture the back rooms were built inside. And as Jun Hyuk stood there in the middle of a party he had interrupted with a gun and a decade's worth of unresolved grief, the full weight of what he had walked into descended on him like a verdict. His men, all 4 of them, had not moved. But they had changed. Something in their posture had shifted, barely perceptibly, with the particular adjustment of people who have just realized that the tactical situation they walked into is not the tactical situation that actually exists. "Chairman Park," Jun Hyuk said. His voice was still controlled. "Credit him that. You fired a weapon in my fiancée's home," Daejung said pleasantly. He reached the bottom of the staircase and walked forward. The crowd parted for him with even greater speed than they had parted for Jun Hyuk. He stopped beside Rejoice, not in front of her, not shielding her, not positioning himself between her and the threat, because he knew she did not require that, and because, more importantly, he respected her too deeply to imply that she did. He stood beside her, equal. That is a significant overstep. Jun Hyuk's jaw worked. "I was not aware of the connection." "No," Daejung said. "You were not." A pause. "That is the problem with acting on incomplete information. The consequences are often disproportionate to the intention." The room was utterly silent. 300 people, barely breathing. Jun Hyuk looked at Rejoice. There was something in his face now that she had never seen there before. Not rage. Rage she knew. Rage she could read. Something more complicated. The expression of a man looking at the full architecture of a situation and understanding, for the first time, every dimension of what it means. "You chose him," Jun Hyuk said. Not an accusation, almost a question. "I chose myself," Rejoice said quietly. He came with that. Something passed through Jun Hyuk's face, a wave of emotion so complex and so rapidly suppressed that most people in the room would have missed it entirely. Rejoice did not miss it. She had spent 2 years learning the topography of that face. "I came here because I believed I had unfinished business," he said. The words were directed at Rejoice, but they carried no menace now. They carried something she had never heard from him before. A raw, unarmored honesty that was more unsettling than any threat. "I realize now that I was wrong. The business was finished. I simply refused to sign the document." Daejung said nothing. He watched Jun Hyuk with the patient, measuring attention of someone who has lived long enough to see many versions of many men, and who understands that the most dangerous moment is never the one that looks dangerous. Jun Hyuk looked at Rejoice one last time. "You deserve this," he said, and the words cost him something. She could see it, the way they passed through him on the way out. "You always deserved more than I knew how to give." Then he turned. He said one word to his men, nothing dramatic, just a single syllable, and they moved with him toward the door. As Jun Hyuk reached the entrance of the ballroom, one of his men, not one of the 4 who had come with him, but a 5th who had apparently entered through the service entrance and positioned himself near the bar, moved. He was 23. Young enough to be reckless, ambitious enough to want to prove something. He had a phone to his ear and an expression that suggested he had just received or transmitted information he should not have. Daejung's head of security, a woman named Song Ji-yeon, 40 years old, absolutely unremarkable in appearance, who had been standing near the south wall for 4 hours, disguised as a catering supervisor, had her hand on the young man's wrist before he completed whatever motion he was beginning. She did not grab. She simply placed her hand on his wrist, and something in the precision of the contact froze him completely. "Phone," she said quietly. He gave it to her. She looked at the screen. Her face remained neutral. She walked to Dae-jung, showed him the screen, and stepped back. Dae-jung looked at what was on the phone. He did not look at Jun Hyuk. He looked at Rejoice. "There is a complication," he said, simply. Rejoice moved to him, looked at the phone. The young operative had been transmitting the house's layout, room by room, exit by exit, the security configuration he had spent the last 2 hours quietly mapping, to someone. The recipient's identifier on the encrypted messaging app was 3 characters, SYK. Rejoice looked up. She was very good at reading faces, better than most people she had ever met, which was saying something. And what she read in Dae-jung's face was not fear. Dae-jung Park did not do fear in any conventional sense. What she read was a very precise, very controlled concern. And that was in many ways more alarming. "Who is SYK?" she asked. Dae-jung took a breath that was less than a second long. "Someone who has been looking for an opportunity for a very long time," he said. "Someone who knew that the easiest way to find a gap in my security was to create chaos first." She understood immediately. The entire room clicked into place, not just the layout of the evening, but the deeper architecture beneath it. Jun Hyuk had not simply shown up out of grief and wounded pride. Jun Hyuk had been used. Someone had gotten to him, had fed him information about Rejoice's whereabouts, about the party, had stoked the old wounds knowing that a man like Jun Hyuk, given the right intelligence and the right provocation, would do exactly what he had done. Walk into the room, create the disturbance, draw every eye, cover the real operation happening at the edges. She turned and looked at Jun Hyuk. He was still at the entrance, had stopped, was watching the exchange with a look on his face that told her he understood from the body language of the room that something had shifted. "Jun Hyuk," she said. Her voice was different now, not warm, not cold either, direct. "Did someone contact you before tonight? Someone who told you where to find me?" A long pause. Something moved behind his eyes. "A source," he said carefully. "What kind of source?" Another pause. Longer. She could see him calculating what to reveal, what it cost him, what the implications were of what he was holding. "Someone who claimed to represent interests that wanted you and Park in a compromised position," he said finally. "I was told it was a negotiation, that your engagement was being used to facilitate." He stopped. His expression shifted from calculating to something colder and more self-directed. Understanding. Arriving like a diagnosis. "I was played." "Yes," Dae-jung said. Simple. No relish in it. Jun Hyuk's face went through a transformation that was genuinely remarkable to watch. The pride, the wounded arrogance, the residual grief all cycling through and then burning off, leaving something underneath that was cleaner and harder and older. The face of a man who has been used and who has enough self-knowledge to hate himself for it. "SYK," he said. "Shin Young Kang." The name landed in the room like a stone in still water. Dae-jung was very quiet for a moment. "Your uncle," he said. "My uncle." Jun Hyuk confirmed. The words were entirely flat, drained of whatever emotion belonged to them. He has been trying to accelerate his position in the organization for 8 years. A war between your network and mine would create opportunities. A war that you walking in here tonight would begin, Daijung said. Yes. Jun Hyuk looked at Rejoice. There was something very specific in that look, an acknowledgement, unspoken, of the full depth of what had been done. Not just to him, not just to Daijung, but to her, her engagement, her home, her evening, her carefully built life, weaponized as a chess piece in someone else's ambition. I am sorry, he said. I do not say that easily. I know, she said. And she did. What followed happened with the speed and efficiency of people who had operated at high levels for a long time. Daejung made 2 phone calls. The second one was 4 minutes long and conducted entirely in Korean, with his voice pitched low and his back half turned to the room. Rejoice, who spoke Korean as fluently as she spoke Igbo, caught enough to understand that by morning, Shin Young-kang's carefully constructed operation was going to encounter obstacles it would not recover from. She did not ask about the details. She had made peace a long time ago. With the parts of Daejung's world she did not govern and could not see. She trusted him. That was the whole of it. She trusted him with a clarity and a groundedness that was entirely different from how she had once trusted Jun Hyuk. Not the desperate, faith without evidence trust of someone who loves too much and sees too little, but the earned, clear-eyed trust of someone who has watched a person make choices consistently over time and found them to be a person worth trusting. Song Ji-yeon and her team dealt with the young operative quietly and completely. Guests who did not belong to either world, the civilians, the artists, the friends, were guided to a secondary lounge with fresh champagne and an Afrobeats DJ who had the professional adaptability to pivot seamlessly from incident to extended after-party. Within 20 minutes, the main ballroom had been stabilized. Jun Hyuk stood near the entrance, not leaving, not approaching. His men had stepped outside. He was alone. Rejoice walked to him. She did not do it because she felt she owed him something. She did not do it out of pity or softness or any failure of the clarity she had fought hard to achieve. She did it because Rejoice Igbo had always believed that some things deserved to be finished properly, that some conversations, left incomplete, metastasized into something that followed people for years. She stopped in front of him. You need to deal with your uncle, she said. I know. And after that, you need to deal with yourself, she said. Not the version you built after I left. The version that existed before you decided that being invulnerable was the same as being strong. He looked at her for a long moment. You always said things I had no answer for. That's because I was right, she said, and the corner of her mouth lifted slightly. Not cruel, just honest. Something that was almost... A smile crossed his face. Are you happy? He asked. Actually happy? She did not hesitate. Yes, she said. Actually. He nodded slowly, absorbing it, accepting it finally as real and final and not a wound, but simply a fact. The way a scar is a fact, present and permanent and no longer bleeding. Good, he said. He turned and walked out of her home. The door closed behind him. She heard his vehicle start, and then the sound faded into the Lagos night. Rejoice stood in the center of the ballroom for a moment. Around her, the evening was reassembling itself, music beginning again, voices lifting, the particular resilience of people who have witnessed something charged with meaning and are now processing it by returning to the ordinary business of being alive. She felt Dae-jung come up beside her. He said nothing for a moment. They stood together, looking at their party. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "This was not the evening I planned." "No," he agreed. "It was more interesting." She looked at him. He was looking forward, the ghost of something warm in his expression. Not amusement exactly, but something close to it. The equanimity of a man who had survived many more complicated nights than this one. "You're not angry," she said. "Why would I be angry?" He turned to look at her. "A man who loved you showed up. He was used by someone else's agenda. He discovered this, acknowledged it, apologized, and left. He behaved in the end with more dignity than I expected." A pause. "And you handled it beautifully, as I knew you would." She exhaled. Something in her chest that had been locked since the moment the gun went off began slowly to release. "Dae-jung," she said. "You owe me a dance." He extended his hand. "I believe I said 20 minutes. You were 7 minutes late. I was dealing with the situation. You still owe me the dance." He smiled. She took his hand. The music shifted something slow, something with a deep bass that resonated in the chest, and they moved into it together, in the center of a room that had held fear and power and grief and confrontation all in the same evening, and was now holding this. Two people choosing each other in front of everyone. Later, much later, when the last guests had gone and the house was quiet and the garden was full of the sounds that Lagos nights are full of, alive and warm and unhurried, Rejoice sat on the terrace steps with her shoes off. And a glass of wine she was no longer really drinking. She was thinking about something her mother had said to her once. Years ago, when Rejoice was 17 and had come home from school furious about an injustice she could not fix. Her mother had sat across from her at the kitchen table in their house in Enugu and said, in the particular Igbo her mother used when she wanted something to land fully, "Rejoice. The world will test you in every way it knows how. It will dress trouble in familiar clothes. Your only job is to know who you are when it arrives. Know who you are when it arrives." She had known. Tonight she had known. She heard the door behind her and did not turn. She knew his footsteps. Dae-jung sat beside her on the steps. He was in his shirt sleeves, jacket gone. He looked, she thought, younger in the dark, more human. She loved that about him, the way he was able, in private, to simply be a person, without the architecture of his power surrounding him. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About my mother," she said. "And about how strange it is to be here, in this life, in this particular night, after everything that had to happen to get here." "Strange," he said. "Or meaningful?" She considered. "Both," she decided. "I think they're the same thing sometimes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The situation with young Kang will be resolved by Thursday." "I didn't ask." "I know." He paused. "I wanted you to know." She turned to look at him. "Are we safe?" He met her eyes. "You have always been safe," he said quietly. "Since the moment I understood who you were, the protection of your safety became non-negotiable. Before you even agreed to have dinner with me, before you agreed to anything." She stared at him. You protected me before I even knew you were protecting me. You were navigating a world with old enemies, he said simply. It seemed irresponsible not to. She opened her mouth, closed it, shook her head slowly. You are the most unusual man I have ever met. Yes, he agreed, untroubled. She laughed, real laughter, the full-throated Lagos laughter that had never changed, no matter how her life changed, around it. And it rang out across the garden and into the dark. He watched her laugh with the expression he always wore when she laughed, the expression she had tried and failed to find words for. A man witnessing something he considers among the best things the world contains. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He let the silence sit, comfortable and unhurried. I am going to need a new chandelier, she said eventually. That shot he fired. The chandelier shook. I saw a crack. I saw it too, he said. That chandelier cost. I know what it cost. You weren't even in the room. Ji-yeon documented it for the insurance claim, he said. She documents everything. Rejoice lifted her head. There's an insurance claim? There will be by morning. She stared at him, then started laughing again. What no one knew, not yet, not fully, was that the real consequence of that evening was not about Jun Hyuk. And it was not about Dae-jung. And it was not even, primarily, about Shin Young-kang and the ambitions that would be decisively interrupted in the days that followed. The real consequence was quieter and more personal, and would take years to fully understand. Jun Hyuk Shin, driving back through Lagos in the early hours of that morning, was a different man than the one who had driven to that party. The confrontation had stripped something from him. The last of a self-deception he had been carrying for 3 years, the story he told himself in which Rejoice's departure had been an injustice. A wrong to be righted, a thing that could be undone if he wanted it enough. In its place was something harder and truer. The understanding that he had failed her, specifically and consequentially, and that her life, the extraordinary, luminous life she had built, was evidence of what she had always been capable of. Freed from the constraints he had placed on her, without ever framing them as constraints. He would spend a long time with that, understanding. It would not be comfortable, but it would, eventually, be useful. He would also, 6 months later, make a single phone call to a woman named Dr. Yoon Ha-yoon, a therapist recommended by the one person in his organization he trusted with such a confidence, and make an appointment. He would cancel it twice. He would keep the third booking. The work he did there over the next 2 years would be the most difficult thing he had ever done in his life. Harder than building an empire. Harder than any violence he had ever survived or commanded. But that was later. That was the future, still forming. On a morning 3 weeks after the party, Rejoice sat in her Lagos office, the real office, the one with the view of the lagoon and the bookshelves that ran floor to ceiling and the coffee that was always exactly right, because she had taught everyone who made it precisely how she liked it. And reviewed the final terms of a trade agreement that would, if it held, open a corridor between West African manufacturers and the Korean market that had been effectively closed for 11 years. She signed it, set down the pen, looked out at the lagoon. On her left hand, the engagement ring caught the morning light. She thought about what it meant, not the ring, not the engagement, not even Dae-jung specifically, though she thought about him too. With the warm, grounded certainty of someone who has made a choice they do not regret. She thought about what it meant to survive, not in the dramatic, cinematic sense, not the survival of that night, of the gun and the confrontation and the old wound appearing at her door, but the survival of the years before that. The survival of a love that almost made her smaller. The survival of the version of herself that had sat on a plane back to Lagos with a broken heart and a ferocious, unkillable determination to become. She had become. And here is what she had learned in all of it. That she wanted to keep. That the heart that loves unwisely is not a failed heart. It is a learning heart. That the woman who walks away from what is diminishing her is not running. She is arriving. That power comes in many forms, and the most unassailable of them is not money or connections or the ability to make a room go quiet when you walk in. Though she had all of those things now. The most unassailable power is knowing exactly who you are when the world tests you. She picked up her phone, sent a message to Day Young, signed the Meridian extension, 11 years, done. 3 dots appeared. Then, I always knew you would. She smiled, put the phone down, looked at the lagoon, let herself feel for just a moment the full weight and texture of everything she had built, the life, the love, the freedom, the extraordinary, ordinary, magnificent present moment of being entirely, undeniably, irrevocably herself. It was more than enough. It was everything.